Okay, we're out again today with the Flash Air 1 tent from REI, and this is mostly a Q&A video to address some of the questions that were asked on our forums in response to posting my first looks at this tent. So I'm going to set it up right now. We'll walk through setup a little bit and then go through your questions. All right, so the first step is we're going to pitch out the four corners of the tent. We do this before we erect it with the pole system. So this is a hybrid single double wall tent, and so you've got on each corner a fly guy line and a guy line for the tent floor. So the corner guy lines for the tent floor get pitched out first, and then we'll attach the guy line tie outs for the fly as soon as we put the pole in. So we'll do these four corners first. This is the foot end pole, and it's used to prop up the peak at the foot end to give you a little more foot room at the end of the tent. So there's a sleeve at the top end that we insert the pole into, and then the other end goes into a grommet there. So that helps keep up the foot end of the tent and gives you some headroom at the bottom of the tent so your sleeping bag does not hit the tent wall. Okay, next we're going to go into this hub assembly that's used to raise the peak of the tent. The tent includes a pole. You can also use a trekking pole with it. This is a DAC aluminum collapsible pole. And then we have this hub assembly and an arch pole here. So when you're using the stock pole, what you end up with is this structure that boosts the apex of the tent with the vertical pole and then provides some additional headroom with this arch pole. And the whole thing is kept into tension with the forces brought out by the rainfly guy lines. So you'll see that when you use the stock pole, this will bend a little bit. And if you try to crank down the tent really tight, you're going to bend it so much that you start altering the shape of the tent. And I'll talk about that more because that has an impact on the tent's wind resistance, and I'll talk a little bit about why this type of structure, one that doesn't have a rigid pole structure all the way around, has a little bit different type of wind resistance than conventional tents. Now, there's two holes in the bottom of that hub, and the small hole is for using the stock aluminum pole, and the large hole is for inserting a trekking pole tip so that you can use a trekking pole with the tent. So I'm going to go ahead and pitch it with the trekking pole today because I want that rigidity, and then I want to illustrate how that rigidity contributes to the overall tent structure. Okay, to insert this assembly, we unzip the rainfly, and then you'll see that there's this arch pole sleeve right here at the apex of the tent. So we're going to put the hub assembly into that sleeve, just like that. And then the tent has a clip that gets clipped around the sleeve right there to keep it in position. Okay, so the proper configuration for this assembly is this arch pole is going to be about level or parallel with the ground surface. So when we decide how long to make our trekking pole, we insert it into the pole tip holder on the hub, and then at the base we'll loop this cord around the handle of the trekking pole. When you're using the stock pole, you'll use that grommet there, and the grommet tip of the stock pole will go in there. So now we can kind of see we have this floppy front wall here. So we'll just tighten our trekking pole up to the point where this wall is now just tensioned and that apex is pretty level. Now this gives you some flexibility in pitching the tent. So when you actually stake out the door and tension it properly, this whole assembly is going to come up like this so that door becomes vertical. The vertical door is essential because that's what prevents overhead rain entry when you have the vestibule open. So you can see that REI says that this is almost a 90-degree bend. And the idea here is that then you can tension it either with the trekking pole or with the stock pole so that it becomes nearly 90 degrees and is able to hold a tension structure in here. Okay, so we've got our pole inserted. Now we're going to zip up the fly. And we'll go ahead and stake the fly out. Now there's still some adjustments to be made, so we're not going to tighten anything up too much right now. But once that fly is staked out, then you'll want to go around and tension, retension all of the, or restake all of the floor guy lines so that the guy line is exiting the floor at a 45-degree angle and you've got as much tension as possible on these. So you've got a perfect trapezoid for the tent floor and there's no tension along the sidewalls. That's a really important part of setting up this tent. Okay, so next we're going to take the 4 corner guy lines on the fly and loop them over the same stakes we used to stake out the floor. And again, right now we're just going to loosely tension that. We'll retighten everything as we go. Okay, so now we have the 5 major guy lines staked out, including the side door as one of them. So now we're going to tension the side door so that that rear wall is tensioned. And it won't take much. We're not going to put a lot of structure into it. Just want to make sure it's nice and tight, and we got a nice tight seam along the tent. And then we'll go around and tension our 4 corner guy lines. And again, we're not going to do it super tight so it deforms the structure at all. Okay, so now that we know we have a good structure and good shape in place, we're going to go crank down that side guy and then just run around the sides one more time to make sure nothing's loose. Now on this one, I'm going to restake it, and you can see we've got a loose edge there, and that's going to flap in the wind. And the reason that loose edge is there is because I don't have this guy line stake out far enough to cause that edge to come into tension. So I'm going to restake that real quick. I'll move that over a few inches. Now I have a nice tight edge there. Final thing I'll do is just to come to the back of the tent and make sure this pole is pulled out that way so everything's in tension. Okay, finally you see that we have a peak vent up here. We want to make sure this little strut is velcroed to the hook and loop closure on that peak vent so that it stays open. Okay, next you have several options to add guy lines. The Flash Air one comes with 4 guy lines. You can certainly add more. Generally, there's 2 types of guy line loops on here. One of the types are these black ribbons here. So we can attach the guy lines here in this direction so that we can prevent the wind from moving the tent back and forth along its long side. There's 2 guy line attachment points at the peak of the tent, and these can be configured to go to the side to prevent this arch from buffeting side to side in a broadside wind. And finally, we have 2 guy line points here at the rear panel of the tent, and they can be pitched either to the sides to help with the broadside wind or angled out towards the back. And that's how we're going to set this up right now. So I'm going to attach 2 right here, and I'll show you how I rig them. REI's guy lines consist of these small plastic toggles, and those toggles are just inserted into the loops very easily, so they can be detached, reattached, moved around without knots or any kind of fussing. So the purpose of a guy line is to prevent the tent from moving. So it's not to stake it out super tight. So if I pull too much tension on this guy line, it's going to disrupt the shape of the tent, and that is not what we want. So I'm just going to barely tension that guy line and do the same on this side. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing with the front of the tent with the Guideline attachment points that are up here. Again, not putting a lot of tension on those guy lines right now. So effectively what you've created here is a structure that is stable in this direction if you get a high wind. So if you get a wind buffeting the front of that tent, the guy lines in the front will prevent this panel from pressing in too far. Likewise, if we get a wind into the rear of the tent, those guy lines are there to keep this very large fabric panel more stable. So the tent comes with 9 stakes. We've used 4 for the floor and the corner guy lines, 5, 6, 7, 8 for the external guy lines, and 9 for the door. The tent comes with these 4 external guy lines, but there are 5 more spots you can add guy lines if you really need the stability in high winds. You have the 2 at the peak here, which can be guyed out to the sides, and that prevents buffeting from side to side. We have 1 here at the back corner that can be used to create an effective ridge line along the apex of the tent. That might be useful if you need some resistance to snow loading or have really strong winds coming in across the rear of the tent. We have 1 here on the side which can be used to prevent the wind from collapsing this wall coming in. And finally we have 1 on the front that can aid in stability for wind coming into the front wall of the tent. Okay, let's go ahead and unzip the door and take a look at a couple of key features. First thing I want to show is that the door is vertical and the fly edge overlaps the door by several inches, so there's probably 4 or 5 inches right there. That way you can be in the tent during an overhead rain and cook or do whatever you want in the vestibule, and a light overhead rain is not going to get in the tent. Obviously, if there's a heavy rain or wind-driven rain coming into the side of the tent like this, this option is not going to work. But it's generally considered to be kind of a fundamental feature of a rain-worthy tent to have a vertical door that's protected by the fly. That way you can get in and out of the tent in the rain without getting the inside of the tent wet. And the other feature worth noting with the fly is that you can further zip it back to give a little better view for stargazing or ventilation on a calm night. So in order to achieve this, we can simply just roll the door all the way back. And then there's another toggle setup right here. And that gives you a little more ventilation. And you can roll up the other side door as well, both in the half position that I showed with this door initially, and rolled all the way back to give you even more views or ventilation immediately above the tent. This is kind of a nice feature on a fair weather night because most of your condensation is going to occur where respiration rises and touches the overhead canopy of the tent fabric. So being able to eliminate moisture through a top layer of mesh means that you're not going to get condensation on the inside roof of your fly. So that's kind of a nice thing. Okay, let's go through and answer some questions from our forum community about the REI Flash Air 1. Question number 1 from Todd T. Question number 1 has to be about that angled trekking pole to frame pole clip holder thingy. So I assume he's talking about either this piece or the whole assembly. He writes, I'd probably trust it if the thingy alone weighed 20 ounces, but how is it in real life? This is a piece of molded plastic that's fairly durable. The pole is DAC aluminum here. And of course, we've got our trekking pole here, or you can use the stock DAC aluminum pole. I don't anticipate this being a failure point of this tent, even in very strong winds. The only issue with this type of plastic is that it can get brittle in very cold environments, but we're talking very cold, 20 below zero or something like that. Otherwise, I would expect this whole assembly to hold up just fine. Question number 2 comes from John, and he writes, it seems like condensation would be bad. I will say that it has the potential to be bad in any kind of single wall tent that doesn't have strong ventilation options. So if you had to button this tent up on a cold night or a night that had a lot of rain, these are your options. So this is your primary peak vent option there in the fly, and then there are 2 lower vents at each end. They're fairly small. The first one is on this far corner, and you can see it's just a little tiny mesh window there that's going to be used to bring in dry air, and hopefully that moist air that's in the tent will escape through this top vent. The other vent is down at the foot end of the tent, and again, it's another just real tiny triangular mesh window right here. Other than that, the other spot where you're going to bring in dry air, of course, is through the door of the tent when the fly is down. Now, given that, we still have a single wall design over more than half of the roof on the foot end of the tent and more than half of the roof on the front end of the tent and the entire back side of the tent. So those are going to be hot spots for condensation, and once we get this tent into the field, we'll get a better feel for where and how condensation forms in this tent. But it is a hybrid single double wall tent. I would expect it to have more condensation than a double wall tent where you have this airspace between the inner tent and the inside of the fly that can be a condensation buffer. John also writes that usually structure and being able to tension panels tightly is important for wind resistance. I won't argue that at all. 2 ways you can make a tent really stable. One is to crank the guy lines down as tight as possible, and the other is to create an arched pole structure. Now, the ability to tension guy lines to very high forces requires the tent to have structure. So in a tent like this, the only guy lines that you're going to be able to tension very, very tightly without disrupting the structure of the tent are the ones that stake out the 4 corners of the floor, and those are not load-bearing guy lines. So let me pull the door closed and let's talk about what's going to happen with a tent like this, where you don't have any structure outside your vertical pole and this arch pole assembly. So when a high wind gust hits this tent from any direction, what's going to happen is you're going to deform the shape of the tent somehow to the limit of pulling guy line tension in one of those guy lines that we've already staked out. Now, we want that stake to be able to hold an enormous amount of force, okay? But that doesn't mean we can pre-tension that guy line right away, because otherwise we'll deform the structure of the tent. So again, the wind resistance of this tent comes in the form of guy line stakeout points on these external guys that are attached to stakes that can hold a lot of force. Okay, so basically this tent's primary structure is a vertical pole right here. So in that respect, it's going to behave similarly to a tarp or a pyramid structure in how it behaves in high winds. The difference is that the corners that are load-bearing here don't go down to the ground. They are attached to some guy lines. So you've got this opportunity for this really dynamic structure that can buffet in the wind. Is that an advantage? Well, yeah, that means there's very few failure points on this tent, and the failure is going to occur down at the tent stakes rather than in the pole structure, which is a very elastic structure. Next question comes from Jay Scott, and he asks, the other thing is that the pole that attaches to the clip holder thingy, which is not a hiking pole, at least in the photos I posted in the original First Looks post, I used the stock pole, is pretty bendy. So when I had tensioned the tent and staked out the guy lines, what that did was put that vertical pole into compression. And so what you get is this semi-arch structure in this pole assembly that is under some compression. That's okay. That's what you want in order to be able to tension the tent properly. I wouldn't expect that to be a weak point in the tent, because although it looks bendy, keep in mind these are poles that are designed to create arches in a dome-style tent. Just because it has a little bend in it doesn't mean it's prone to failure. You're just not going to get a high load coming down in that compressive force direction that's going to cause that pole to snap. J. Scott also writes, I wonder if an option is to just design this to have a hiking pole positioned at the top of the tent, like a pyramid, I assume, and wouldn't that be stronger? Yes, and he also noted you'd lose headspace, which is already tight. I'd agree, and that's really the purpose of this arch pole, is to prevent that pyramid peak at the top of the tent to give you some better headroom inside the tent. Okay, Rex has a series of questions, and his first one is, what's the fabric coating? It's definitely a nylon fly. It's not very slippery, so it's either polyurethane or some mixture of polyurethane and silicone. We'll find out and post that spec when we publish our review on the tent. What's the hydraulic head rating for the floor and ceiling? That spec was not given by REI, but we have a suitor tester back in the office, and we'll be sure to measure the hydrostatic head rating of both the bathtub floor, which does feel like a slightly different fabric than the fly, but again, not sure on that. How sturdy is that 2-ounce DAC aluminum pole? A few of your photos show an unsettling curve. Well, let's take a look at it. So again, this is the same type of pole you're going to find in a tent that uses an arched pole structure like a geodesic dome. And so there's going to be some flex to it. This is a fairly stiff pole. It looks to be about 9 millimeters in diameter. We'll put that spec in the review when we figure it out, as it says on here. Rex's next question is, how sturdy is that 2-ounce DAC aluminum pole? This is a Featherlight NFL DAC pole. These are well known for being very strong poles. So yes, you can generate a bend to it, but no, I don't think this is going to be a failure point in the structure. I think a trekking pole like this, of course, will be a much stronger option and perhaps provide more stability, but that's really not the purpose of the pole. The pole is to hold up the tent and allow the guidelines to assume most of the force. Next question is, I've always been confused by REI's peak height spec. Since I don't know if that's inside the tent or outside, what is the measured inside peak height? Well, I brought a tape measure along, so let's look at it. So that 42 inches that REI specs as the peak height, that's going to be your outside spec. And it's actually a little bit shorter than that. Our trekking pole right now is pitched at a height of about 40 inches. Yeah, about 40 inches. And you have some flexibility up and down. But if you deviate too much from 40 to 42 inches, you're going to disrupt the pyramid shape of the tent. So it doesn't have a lot of flexibility because of the geometry. Inside, you have an angled roof line. So you have a short end on this, on the front vestibule side, and a little bit taller peak height on the rear wall side. So on the front side, we're looking at about 35 inches, and on the back side, we're looking at about 39 inches. So this isn't a tent for tall people by any means. I'm 5'7". I can sit inside the tent and not brush the ceiling with the top of my head, even if I'm sitting up straight. So for me, not a big deal. But if you're 6 foot or taller, you might want to sit in one of these before you decide to commit to it. So those values are the shortest values I would spec on this tent because I have it pitched at about its lowest practical setting. Next question is, how much side-to-side headroom does the hub pole provide? So instead of a traditional pyramid where you have a center pole and no headroom because you have a little peak in there, then you have this pole which has this hub assembly that provides a flat arch across the tent. And so that distance is about 12 inches or so, and so that gives you a little bit of side-to-side mobility inside the tent for headroom. How does this compare to similar tents like the Tarp Tent Eon, Z-Pax, Plexamid, and Six Moon Designs Lunar Solo? So let's talk about the Eon and Plexamid first. Those are Dyneema composite fabric tents. They're expensive. This This tent is $250 retail. Both the tarp tent and the Z-Packs tents are $535 and $549. So much more expensive. The Eon and Plexamid are a little bit lighter than the Flash Air one. This is a 20-ounce tent. Those two tents are both in the 15-ounce range. In addition, the Eon and Plexamid have a little more headroom inside the tent, so might be a better choice for taller people. In terms of storm resistance, just looking at the designs of all three of those tents and having used them, I wouldn't expect them to be much different. None of these tents are designed for really high wind, stormy conditions above the tree line. I wouldn't expect the Eon or the Plexamid to have any particular advantages in storm resistance over the Flash Air. As for the Six Moon Designs Lunar Solo, that's a silicone coated polyester fly. So it's going to have less stretch in wet conditions and be more resistant to UV degradation. Now, on a tent like this, the Flash Air one has a smaller footprint and wind profile than the Lunar Solo. The Lunar Solo is a tent that I recommend taller or larger people take a look at, but for the most part, there's a lot more fabric and it's not going to be as wind resistant as the Flash Air one. And finally, how much head and toe vertical clearance lying down with a pad and quilt. So Rex is asking if this foot pull that boosts up the headroom, so to speak, in the foot end of the tent, is it a gimmick or does it have a meaningful contribution to the space inside? I think it's meaningful. I'm on a Cascade Designs Neo Air Uberlight right now. I have a Feathered Friends Tanager sleeping bag, and I can lay in my bag with my toes pointed upward. I have size 9 feet, and I don't touch any of the walls inside the tent. So there is enough foot room for me down there. I don't think that would be the case with my winter sleeping bag. I think the surface of the sleeping bag might brush up against the walls as I move around. And in terms of head vertical clearance, you've got a fairly steep wall up here, unlike tents like the Lunar Solo, which are very shallow and more symmetrical. So here we have the peak of the tent more towards the head end. Okay, so as for head clearance, when I'm laying down, if I just sit up, my head does not brush the back of that tent. But again, I'm only 5'7", so your mileage may vary if you're a taller person. Okay, the next question is whether or not you can fit a backpack inside the tent, for example, above the head end of your sleeping bag. So let's take a look inside. First, we'll make sure our pad goes all the way to the end of the tent. And then you can kind of see here how much room is available. It's about 14 to 16 inches. You can see that I have my 30-liter pack up at the head end of the tent. But trying to fit an expedition pack in here would be problematic, and you'd probably have to capitalize on stowing it inside the vestibule. Okay, that's it. There's a rundown of the REI Flash Air 1 tent. It's a hybrid single wall, double wall tent that uses a trekking pole or a stock vertical pole in combination with this arch peak pole assembly that I showed you earlier. It weighs about 20 ounces, or you can add 2 ounces if you take the stock pole with you. Includes 4 sets of external guy lines, 9 stakes, requires at least 5 to stake the tent out. Okay, so hopefully that answers some of the questions you may have had about this tent. We are looking forward to reviewing it in inclement conditions, and you can look for our review on it later this year.